This is a Fiat 500 Abarth. Now this isn't a brand new 500 Abarth, and that is intentional. You see, a new 500 Abarth starts somewhere around $21,000 with shipping, but the average asking price on AutoTrader for a used 500 Abarth is just a shade over $12,000. As I film this video, there are currently 71 used 500 Abarth models listed on AutoTrader for less than $10,000. The cheapest high mileage ones are listed for like $7,500. There are quite a lot of them right around $9,000, and I'm going to tell you right now, this thing is the most fun you're ever going to have for $9 grand. I rented this 500 Abarth here in Southern California using Turo, which is this service that lets you rent other people's cool and interesting cars instead of normal, boring airport rental cars. You can sign up for Turo if you click the link in the description below, and you'll get $25 off your first rental. Now, Turo gives me a budget to rent cars, and I selected this one. Yes, that's right, I chose to rent a used Fiat, and I've been driving it around all week, and I haven't stopped smiling the entire time. Now, before I get started, yes, I know this thing is tiny. In fact, at roughly 140 inches in length, it's a foot shorter than a Mini Cooper and roughly 4 feet shorter than a Toyota Camry. I also know that it only has a puny little 4-cylinder with only 160 horsepower, so just how much fun could it possibly be? Well, quite a lot of fun, actually. Let's start by just taking a listen to it. That doesn't sound like a normal Fiat 500, and indeed it isn't. The 500 Abarth is the performance model of the Fiat 500, and it has some upgrades over the standard one. There's better suspension, there are a few different styling touches, there's that exhaust note, and there's extra horsepower. This thing has 160 horsepower. That's a huge jump over the standard 500, which has only 101. So today I'm going to take you on a tour of the 500 Abarth, and I'm going to show you all of its interesting quirks and its unusual features, and then I'm going to get it out on the road, and I suggest you stick around for that part because it goes a long way to showing why I think this thing is so much fun. And then I'm going to give it a Doug score. And for more of my thoughts on the 500 Abarth, click the link below to visit autotrader.com/oversteer, where I've also compiled a list of my favorite hot hatchbacks currently for sale on AutoTrader. Now I'm going to start on the outside with one of the most immediately obvious things you see when you look at the 500 Abarth, and that would be the graphics. The painted wheels, the painted mirror caps, and that little white stripe going down the side that eventually turns into like train tracks. Now I've complained about certain cars with over-aggressive graphics in the past, but for some reason I really like the graphics on this one. It's this tiny little bubble-shaped car with these sports car graphics. It's almost like it's saying, yes, I can be a performance car, really, look at me try. Now personally, my favorite thing are the painted wheels. You can get a 500 Abarth with silver wheels or with black wheels, but I love the white painted wheels. It makes it look like a 60s rally car or something. I think they're really cool looking. The problem, however, is wear. Take a closer look. That stuff on there that looks like dirt, it isn't. That stuff is wear, and it really shows itself. You can't get it off no matter how much you scrub. It's just kind of on there, and you can really tell because, well, they're white. Next up, another interesting thing on the outside of the Abarth. Now, every 500 has these circular headlights that sort of match the circular design of the car. Now below that, every 500 also has circular turn signals, so there's a circle and then another circle. The Abarth models, however, they're supposed to be more aggressive and angry, so they also get fog lights, which are mounted down here, yet another circle. So the front of every angry, upset sports car 500 Abarth has 6 cute little circular headlights on it, which I find to be kind of funny. The other thing you'll see in the front of this car, this here, not a Fiat badge, that would be an Abarth badge, and it's one of oh so many on the outside of this car. There's one in front, there's one on either side in that little white graphic I showed you earlier, there's one on the side fenders in the rear, a little badge in the back that says Abarth. You go all the way to the back on the tailgate and you will find another Abarth badge. Additionally, go under the hood and you will find the little Abarth Scorpion logo instead of a Fiat logo or a 500 logo. And maybe the craziest one is the wheels. Each wheel has that little Abarth Scorpion in the center cap, and each wheel also has the word word Abarth printed on the side of the wheel. So the word Abarth appears on the outside of this car like 40 zillion times. Here's the interesting thing, the word Fiat never appears once. And check this out, you climb inside this car and the steering wheel says Abarth, not Fiat. The floor mats say Abarth and not Fiat. Even the owner's manual is in its own Abarth specific pouch, and when you actually get to the manual itself, that is the only time you will actually see the word Fiat printed amidst an enormous amount of other Abarth logos and graphics. Ultimately, when you're driving this car, you're not in a Fiat, you're in an Abarth. With that said, there are some 500 graphics to illustrate the fact that this is a Fiat 500. I like, for example, the one hidden in the headlights. There's also a little Fiat 500 graphic on the door sill. It says 500, that's kind of cool. And on the side of the dashboard where the airbag would go off, it says 500 there. But that's it, 500, Abarth, no Fiat. Next up, moving on to the 500 Abarth's other interior quirks, there are a surprising number of them, starting to the left of the steering wheel with the turbo boost gauge. Not too many cars come with a factory turbo boost gauge, but this one does. Now, one of the things I like about the turbo boost gauge is that the color Fiat has chosen to represent any number above basically 20 psi is this dark red that is absolutely invisible in the daytime. The thing actually goes to 24, but you really have to squint in order to see it. Now, within the turbo boost gauge is another really cool feature, and that would be the shift light. This car has a shift light. When you put it in sport mode and you get really high in the rev range, the shift light turns on and lights up to let you know that it's time to upshift, and it seems like a really cool little feature. Next up, next to the boost gauge and the shift light, one of the most interesting turn signal stalks I've seen. Most of the operations are pretty normal, but there is one unusual one. When you go to put on the brights, you can't unless the headlights are on, which is weird because you flip the end of the switch to turn on the headlights, but you push the switch forward to turn on the brights. You'd think those would happen independently, but they don't. That's actually a clever little piece of engineering. Next up, another interesting little 500 Abarth detail. Now, this car has no touchscreen. In fact, I'm not sure if this is still the case, but when the 500 came out, there wasn't even a navigation system offered. The optional navigation system was like a clip-on Garmin that you could just go buy at Target for like 80 bucks. I'm serious. That was the factory navigation system. So there's no touchscreen, and that makes it a little odd to change and set various different vehicle settings. One of the vehicle setting controls is in the center gauge cluster, and you control it with these three little buttons. You press one to cycle between menus, and then you press the other two to change the various different options. Now, because the menu screen is so tiny, it results in some interesting things. For example, most cars have a little electronic speed limiter. You can set a speed limit and it'll beep when you go over that speed limit to remind you not to speed. Usually it's called like electronic speed limiter or personal speed electronic limiting. In this car, it's called speed beep. You set it, speed beep, and then it beeps when you go over a certain speed. A couple of other interesting ones. One of the other menu items in the gauge cluster says C radio. Yeah, I would like to see the radio. Why would anyone turn that off? And then scrolling further, there's one that says auto close. Now, I know I can go in the manual and find out what these things do, but is that really the best way they could have abbreviated whatever that is? Now, it's the same story in the middle with the stereo display. There's no touchscreen. It's just one little tiny display, pixelated in orange and black, and it has a couple of interesting operations of its own. For example, when you turn on the car, a lot of cars give you nice little startup graphics with the manufacturer logo. This thing, well, it just says Fiat in orange. So I guess that is one time where it says Fiat in this car. They didn't want to tune it to say Abarth. Also interesting in this stereo, how about the fact that when you press menu, the very first thing that comes up is system reset. No. System reset yes, system reset no. That is the default first menu item. Also interesting, how about the fact that the volume controls in this car are absolutely atrocious. In every other car, it's a little knob. You want more volume, you twist it. You want less, you twist it the other way. In this car, it's a button. So if you want it to be louder, press, 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 press. Very annoying. Next up, moving down from the stereo, one of the interesting things you'll notice in the 500 Abarth's interior is the gear lever. Specifically, you'll notice that it's not mounted on the floor, but rather, basically, it comes out of the center console just below the climate controls. Now, part of the reason for this is that Fiat Chrysler, they're just cheap, and they didn't want to install an actual center console in this car, but frankly, I think it benefits drivers. Because the shifter is that high up, basically, you don't have to take your hand very far off the wheel in order to shift, so you can just sort of go boom, 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 a lot easier than you could if the shifter was all the way down here. And I really like that. Another interesting item, I think this is something only I would notice and maybe only I would care about, but on the little plastic part that tells you where the airbag comes out, it doesn't just say airbag, it says air in capital letters and then bag in lowercase letters. It says that on the dashboard and on the steering wheel. Airbag, airbag. I don't know why Fiat felt they had to stylize the little plastic piece that showed the airbag location, but they did. They also stylized the hood release in an unusual way. Most hood releases are just in the driver's footwell, black plastic, nobody really pays any attention to them. In this car, it's this little red hood release. It's like a sporty hood release, or like an ejector seat. Maybe they wanted to make it cool because they knew as a Fiat Chrysler product that, well, you'd be pulling it a lot. Moving back to the middle of the car, a couple of interesting things in the climate control vicinity, one of which is the fact that on the climate controls themselves, on the little dial that lets you choose between recirculating air or outside air coming in the car, the little car depicted isn't a standard normal car, but rather a little Fiat 500, and I think that is a nice, cool little touch that few people will probably notice or care about. Now, directly below the climate controls, you will notice a little bank of switches and a little hole. The switches are interesting. There's 3 blank switches and the fog lights. The hole is a hole. I'm not really sure why it's there. It almost looks like a speaker, but I don't think it is. There's just sort of a little hole with a grate on it in the middle of the dashboard. Next up, we have to talk about the sunroof situation, which is one of the most ridiculous I've seen in any car. Now, to open the sunroof, it's pretty normal. There's a little button, you push it to pop it up, and then push it again, and it slides back. That's fairly normal. The weird thing is the cover that covers the sunroof. This cover is actually mesh. It's see-through. So if you're trying to shield yourself from the beating sun, if you live in Arizona or New Mexico or Texas, and you want to close it so that you can just get some shade, turn on the AC, well, you can't. You're always going to get some sun through that top panel, even if you have the sunshade closed. It doesn't really matter what you want. You're getting sun. Next up, we move on to the center console in this car. Now, this is a tiny car, so the center console only has enough room for 2 things. Number 1, the parking brake, and number 2, an armrest. And I don't mean 2 armrests, one for the driver and one for the passenger. I mean 1 single armrest for the driver. Sorry, passenger, you'll just have to put your hands in your lap. There isn't even enough room in the center console for cup holders. Instead, Fiat had to stick them basically in back. The cup holders of this car are behind the front seats, and that's really the only placement for them. And speaking of the back, next up, it will surprise you if you haven't spent any time around a Fiat 500 yet, but even though this thing is incredibly tiny, a foot shorter than a Mini Cooper, yes, it has back seats, and yes, I'm sort of the self-appointed expert at climbing into back seats of tiny cars, so here goes. All right, put the front seat forward and begin the process. Oh, well, that actually wasn't really all that difficult. Ooh, a quarter. Put the seat back, and, well, okay. I don't have any room back here. Now, Fiat didn't really expect anybody to use the back seat in this car, a point that's driven home by the fact that the factory location for the tire compressor you get with one of these is Velcroed to the back seat footwell behind the front seat. That's where it's supposed to go when the car comes out of the factory, the theory being that nobody's going to get in your back seat, so you might as well use that for storage. Now, interestingly, the worst part about the back seat of the 500 isn't the legroom, which is kind of funny because there is none. Instead, it's the headroom. Take a look what I mean. I'm going to close this. Ow. And then I sit here with my head right up against the window. In fact, with the headrests in their fully retracted position, they hit up against the window, so I don't really understand how anybody even slightly tall could ever sit back here. Now, in addition to all the quirks and features I've already mentioned, it's worth noting that this car is ultimately built by Fiat Chrysler, and so it has some of the quality problems that Fiat Chrysler is sort of known for. As I mentioned them, keep 2 things in mind. Number 1, you can get one of these for $9 grand, so maybe they're not really all that bad, but number 2, this car has only 40,000 miles on it, so take a look and decide whether you think this wear is normal for a 40,000 mile car. I will start with just the general feel of the interior. It's pretty cheap. If you're buying this thing because you think it's going to be sort of like a Mini Cooper, like a high-end little hatchback, it isn't. Everything kind of feels flimsy, you can move it all, and everything feels pretty cheap and crappy. A good example of that is that little armrest I was talking about, the 1 single driver armrest. It's already broken. The entire top part broke off, it's gone, and Fiat people tell me this is incredibly common. Another example, how about the fact that the little fabric loop you use to pull the front seat forward and get people in the back seat is fraying. which is insane because, let's be honest, we know it isn't ever being used to actually get people in the backseat, and yet after only 40,000 miles and 4 years on the road, it looks terrible. Another cheap detail, how about the fact that when you open the sun visors and put them down and slide the cover for the mirror over so you can see the mirror, you can actually see the cover sliding into the leather rather than into the visor like in every other car. It's just ridiculous looking. It's like how you can see your tongue inside your cheek if you really push on it. Other issues, when I went to turn this car on to drive it for the first time after I rented it, I noticed the tire pressure monitor light was on. I thought one tire was low, but actually the entire tire pressure monitoring system is just broken. It's malfunctioned and it isn't working. Also worth noting, like I mentioned before, those painted wheels are fading, and it's not just on that one wheel I showed you earlier, it's on all the wheels. Every single wheel is sort of fading in the same way, and that kind of takes away from the cool white wheel look. So those are the quirks and features of the Fiat 500 Abarth. Now, normally I enjoy poking around the cars to find their quirks and features more than just about anything else, but not today. Today, I can't wait to drive. Now, the first thing I want to tell you, I got to tell you a little secret about the 500 Abarth, and that would be the sport button. That is the key to unlocking the 500 Abarth. I've driven a lot of cars with a lot of sport buttons, and usually I can barely tell the difference. This is like the most effective sport button ever. In this crappy little car, you press it and it turns it from like a normal economy car into, I don't know what it does, it like readies this thing for battle. But if you're interested in this car, I would definitely recommend pushing the sport button on the test drive. If you don't really understand why everybody raves about this car so much, it's probably because you drove it without the sport button pushed. Now I'm sitting here at a stoplight ready to go up a curvy little road, and it's a little shaky. You can hear some rattles. I was going over some bumps in a parking garage, and it's like you're pushing a shopping cart over them, and it's like boom, boom. You're just kind of like, all right, I don't need that in my life. All right, going up a little curvy road here. It's so much fun. I'm not even going faster than the other cars. That's the thing. I'm not past. There's a Sequoia going faster than me right now. The steering is so wonderfully communicative too. It doesn't feel over assisted. It doesn't feel stupid and fake. And that exhaust note, it just feels angry. I also love the transmission lever being right here, the gear lever. I can just go right to it and make quick changes like that. I mean, boom, instantaneous. It's not because I'm really good at this, it's just because it's right there and it just kind of falls in line. You got your hand on the wheel and then boom, you're on the gear lever. It's one little motion. Listen to that. The thing is, it doesn't feel sluggish when you're driving it. Yeah, you get the sense you're not going as fast as like in a Ferrari or a Lamborghini or whatever, even an AMG, anything like that. But it doesn't really matter because it sounds amazing. And when you're going through the corners, the steering is so wonderful and you're low and there is some body lean, but it's almost like kind of in a fun way. It kind of feels like you're really part of the car, one giant bubble making a turn. It's just hilarious. It doesn't feel stable. It doesn't at all feel stable. It doesn't feel like, oh, like I'm in a Porsche and I can go take every curve at 100. It feels like it's leaning and there's torque steer, and that's kind of the fun of it. And I'll tell you something, the mid-range power in certain circumstances really does feel like enough. In some circumstances, it feels like the car's a little underpowered. When you're going away from a stoplight, you're like, oh, I could use a little more. But in some circumstances, this car has just the right amount of mid-range power. This isn't the kind of sports car where you sit there, you know, in the car and you can just sit there concentrating and you know, oh, I can do anything and I can go at any speed around any corner and I feel tough. Instead, this is the kind of car where you're like, why does it sound like that? This is the stupidest thing. It's so good around curves. The steering is just great. And the car is so small that you have no problem positioning it exactly where you need to be. The exhaust note at all moments, even if you're not having fun at that precise second, you drop the accelerator, you hear that. It's so crashy though. It's so crashy. I mean, this car is definitely not designed like a sports car to make you feel confident and make you feel stable. But if you go into it knowing that, and it's gonna be crashy and it's gonna roll around and you're gonna slide in the seats in a hard corner, if you go in knowing that, and you know that you spent $9,000 and you got that exhaust note, you almost don't care about any of that stuff. And so that's the Fiat 500 Abarth. This thing is pretty stupid looking, to be honest. It's absolutely tiny. It has typical Chrysler quality issues, and frankly, it isn't even really all that fast, but it is so much fun. Put this thing in sport mode, find a good twisty road, and all your problems go away, as if you had a Porsche Boxster or a convertible Ferrari. But the difference is this thing can be had for only $9,000, which makes it an insane value, assuming that it stays reliable. And with that, on to the Doug score. Starting with the weekend categories and styling, I think the 500 Abarth is really cool looking, just the right amount of aggressive, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Acceleration does 0 to 60 in the high 6-second range, and it gets a 2 out of 10. Handling is very good, but not quite on the level of top sports cars, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Fun factor, however, is near the top. It's almost impossible to drive this thing in sport mode and not smile and laugh, and it gets an easy 8 out of 10. Finally, there's cool factor, and it's just not that cool. Most people think it's just another Fiat 500, and they're making zillions of them, so it gets a 5 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 28 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories, starting with features. It's unusually low on features for a modern car, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Comfort is fine, but not particularly good, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Quality is very average. This thing isn't falling apart or breaking down, but it doesn't seem like it's going to last very long, and it gets only a 5 out of 10, which is a really low score for a relatively new car. Practicality, it has a lot of cargo room with the seats folded, but its incredibly small size and tiny rear seats means I can't give it more than a 4 out of 10. Finally, there's value, and I have no choice. This car is just insanely fun for the price, and assuming it stays reliable, it earns a 10 out of 10, becoming only the second car to do so for a daily score of 27 out of 50. Added up, and the Doug score is 55 out of 100, and you can see how it stacks up against other hot hatchbacks I've reviewed. It's no Civic Type R or Focus RS, but it's so much fun. More fun, in my opinion, than the more expensive Fiat 124 Spider Abarth.